Hey everybody, what's going on? And welcome back, or I should say welcome to a special edition of the Saturdays in Storrs podcast, which you can find as always on the Crossover channel. This is a special edition of the podcast today because it is the State of the Program series episode, which we are doing for the UConn Huskies. I know it's been a little bit of a while since I've uploaded on this UConn podcast. It really just hasn't been too much to talk about in the world of UConn basketball right now, just considering it is the offseason. Not too much action is going on at this point. But we are going to be talking about, as always, on the State of the Program series, what UConn has lost, what they've added, what their coaching is looking like, how they stack up both in the Big East and nationally, and what the vibes are going to next season. But before we get into that, if you like this podcast or anything else you see on this channel, please engage with our content any way you can, whether it's liking our videos, subscribing to our channel, or just telling other people about it. It really does help with growing what we do here at the Crossover. So as always, my name is Kanaye, and I'm joined by my co-host Josh today for this special edition of the Saturdays in Storrs podcast. And we're going to be talking about the UConn Huskies. Definitely a little bit of a down year, just considering what they did the 2 years prior to this past season, being the back-to-back national champions. And what we thought was going to be a season where they were chasing a three-peat. Obviously, it was a little underwhelming for UConn standards. I think they missed on a few guys in the portal. And I really just think that it kind of came down to a lot of guys maybe not making the leaps that others, including myself, thought that they could have made. They ended up losing in the second round to the eventual national champion, Florida Gators. I would argue that they probably gave Florida the best run for their money out of every opponent Florida faced in the NCAA tournament. I think that's more so credit to the coaching staff, more so than what was done by the players. That's not a slight to the players anyway. I just think that more so is a credit to what the staff, Kamani Young, Luke Murray, and Dan Hurley, of course, did in constructing their game plan to kind of shut down Walter Clayton, Elijah Martin, and Will Richard in that first half. But again, that's not what this episode is about. It's about what the state of the UConn Huskies program is going to next year. And a good place to start is what they lost. Now, the losses, of course, there was a lot that they couldn't control. They had a few guys graduate, but they did lose some guys in the transfer portal. I think probably the biggest loss, or most definitely the biggest loss, I should say, was them losing Liam McNeely. He was their 5-star freshman this past year, was their leading scorer at around 14.5 points per game. He is going to the NBA draft and is mocked to be a top 20 pick, probably. We'll see what ends up happening with that. On top of that, they lost to Sandiar and Samson Johnson, 2 stars, 2 graduation. And in the transfer portal, they lost Aiden Mahaney, Isaiah Abraham, Ahmad Noel, and Yusuf Sangare. Now, I know earlier in the season, or going into Big East tournament play, there was the viral clip of Dan Hurley saying 60% of his roster was thinking about hitting the portal. And when you're considering who probably didn't get the playing time they wanted or who maybe wasn't working out, it makes sense. They lost Aiden Mahaney, who was supposed to be one of the stars this past season, just wasn't the right fit at UConn. Isaiah Abraham was the guy who was a former 4-star but didn't play really at all. Ahmad Noel was a former top 40 recruit who, again, really didn't play all too much in the minutes he did. He looked very much like a freshman. And Yusuf Sangare, who, again, really didn't play. So those guys are out the window. And I would honestly probably have UConn's losses at around a 7. I think losing your leading scorer is kind of tough. And definitely losing 2 starters definitely hurts the case too.
I actually kind of want to bump it up to an 8. I think it's not a horrible loss considering what you said. Losing possibly 60% of your roster to the portal. And I think that some of these transfers aren't the worst. Aiden Mahaney just didn't work out. I think that's kind of the biggest point, and obviously Kanaye can talk to end on that point. Mahaney was going to leave anyway. He was the freshman talent. He was the prospect. There really wasn't much to be done. And I feel like his contribution wasn't as serious as the points were. He never really felt like the main guy on this team. And he wasn't supposed to be the main guy on this team either. So I'm bumping it to an 8. I think that might be the best choice at the moment.
Yeah, no, I'm willing to come to an 8 for that. I definitely think the losses, which they could have controlled, really weren't bad at all. Just regarding the trans guys who hit the portal. Losing Liam McNeely definitely hurts. I think he's a guy whose game is a little bit better suited for college than it is the NBA, and I think him coming back would have really been both beneficial for him and, of course, the program. But, of course, it does hurt losing 2 program guys like Samson Johnson and Hassan Yar, who are really parts of the team for the time that they were in Storrs. But to get into what they've added, I think what's most important in terms of what they've added is what they brought back. Sometimes the best gets are the ones you already have. They were able to return Solo Ball, Alex Caravan, Terrace Reed Jr., Jalen Stewart, and Jaden Ross. Solo Ball was one of the breakout guys this past year and now in a starting role as opposed to his freshman year, where he really didn't play on a very, very stacked UConn roster that had a loaded backcourt. He averaged around 14.5 points per game, just behind Liam in terms of scoring. Alex Caravan was a little underwhelming. I think he had more on his plate this past year than what he's really comfortable with. I think he's better suited as a third or fourth option type of guy, but he's coming back for his senior season. Definitely important getting him back. He's probably the best winner in the sport. Has a chance to etch his name in the college basketball history books if he's able to get a third national championship. You bring back Terrace Reed, who I think definitely has a chance to make a huge leap now in a starting role with Samson Johnson graduating. I would honestly have Terrace Reed right behind Zuby Ejiofor in my preseason Big East Player of the Year favorites. And on top of that, you bring back Jalen Stewart and Jaden Ross, two guys in that junior class with solo ball who have big chance to make leaps. I would definitely think Jalen Stewart's in a starting role this year, which we're going to get into in a second. But in terms of what they've added in the transfer portal, the biggest name is Silas Demery Jr. He played point guard at Georgia this past season, averaged 13.5 points per game, helped lead the Georgia Bulldogs to the NCAA tournament alongside Asa Newell. I think he's perfect. He's a perfect fit for what Dan Hurley wants out of a point guard. Kind of fits that Tristan Newton mold of a taller point guard who's capable of hitting deep contested three-pointers, can create, do stuff off the dribble, get to the rim, get to the free throw line. Two things that this UConn team lacked completely this past year in terms of drawing fouls and just having any shot creation whatsoever. On top of that, they've added Dwayne Karoma from Lemoyne, who's probably going to be in a bench role. Alec Melender, same thing goes for him. He's going to bring some shooting. Malachi Smith, I think, is the second biggest add in this transfer portal class. At Dayton, he was a starting point guard, averaged close to 11 points per game and nearly 5 assists. He does come in with some injury concerns, but when he's healthy, he's really productive. He's going to bring defense. He's going to bring energy off the bench in what I would assume is a six-man role. And then freshman-wise, you're adding Braylon Mullins, who's a top 25 recruit. Same thing goes with Eric Ryba. And Jacob Furphy's coming over from overseas. And then they also added Jaden Ross's younger brother, Jacob Ross, into the fold as well. So considering those adds, I would honestly have UConn at an 8. I think getting the retention of guys you already had in your program is so important. But really, you didn't need to add too much in the portal. I think really what you needed was going and getting one of the better point guards in this transfer portal cycle, on top of just adding more depth all around.
Certainly. I think personally the biggest thing you could want is your returners to come back, particularly a guy like Caravan, because first off, he was supposed to leave 2 years ago. He was supposed to leave last year. He comes back this year. He could be the main scorer and the lead guy on this team, but also solo ball and Terrace Reed could have been offered a lot more at a lot of other schools, and they both stayed. But yes, bringing in Silas Kamari is great. The depth is definitely there from the transfers. And I think the freshmen could have very nice roles, especially a guy like Braylon Mullins, who was a top 20 consensus choice on the ESPN 100 list. Furphy and Ross, I don't know if they're going to get much time, but this is a deep and very strong team. So an 8, I think, is a perfect score.
Yeah, I just think that they very much addressed a lot of the weaknesses that this past year's team had. And it really is reminiscent of what they did going into the 2023 season, the first of the two national championships, where you kind of have a lot of guys fill in similar roles. You have Silas in that Tristan Newton role. You have solo ball in what you hope is the Jordan Hawkins role, Terrace Reed in the Adama Sanogo role. We're hoping guys can kind of make that leap. And I think right now is probably a good time to get into the starting lineup, at least my projected starting lineup. I know I've voiced it, I believe, in the past on the Saturdays and Storrs podcast. But I think the starting lineup this year is going to be Silas Demery at the 1, solo ball at the 2, Jalen Stewart at the 3. I know that's probably going to maybe turn some heads there. I know a lot of people think Braylon's going to start. Maybe I'll touch on that in a second. And then Caravan at the 4, obviously, and then Terrace Reed would be the start.
Yeah, I kind of agree with this one. I get the Braylon Mullins question is a very strong one, but Stewart has been consistent and strong scorer. And I know Hurley does like to value his experienced players. Mullins is still very good. He can perhaps fill in that Liam McNeely freshman role. I don't think he'll be like Liam McNeely, but he is a great scorer, and he could start a few games, but I think he'll likely be that sixth man off the bench and a one-and-done prospect that UConn will use to its best.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think Jalen Stewart has the experience, and I think that's so important when you're in the UConn program. Knowing how to execute UConn's offense, both offense and defense, is just so important. And it's so hard for first-year freshmen and transfers to come into a system like UConn and have success immediately. Tristan Newton struggled in his first year at UConn in the early stretch of that season, running the point. I'm sure Silas will definitely add some bumps in the road at some point in the early stretch of the year. Aiden Mahaney definitely struggled a lot with trying to run UConn's offense. It's tough for freshmen to grasp the offense and defense right away. And I think Braylon Mullins has a good head on his shoulders, and I think he's going to be a big contributor for this team. But I do think his physical makeup does worry me slightly. Just playing in the Big East, he does have good height at 6'5", 6'6". He's probably going to play on the wing, but he's not the greatest ball handler. He's probably more so of a 2 or 3. And I just think Jalen Stewart's size kind of also gives that edge added to his experience over Braylon Mullins. But in terms of coaching, Dan Hurley is one of the most polarizing figures in the sport. A lot of people label him as college basketball's villain. How do you feel regarding Dan Hurley and the coaching going for UConn going into this year?
I'm very slightly down. Once again, he gave Florida everything he could, and is still that guy who won 2 back-to-back championships. I mean, it's really hard to not put out one of the greatest, not just UConn coaches of all time, but one of the greatest coaches to ever do it. I think coming off of a bad season adds some fuel to the fire for him. He's a guy that lives off of this stuff. He's married to the game. I think this is something that he has really put a lot of time into. I'm fine keeping it at a 10, kind of for a 9, so the slight distrust in how he could be, but he is all the way there when it comes to bringing UConn back to that Natty title.
Yeah, I personally had coaching at 10. I think Dan Hurley learned a lot from last season. I think he knows now that sometimes it's not worth getting into some of the media trouble that he tends to kind of get into, time after time, especially with a team that maybe wasn't constructed as well as the previous two. And I think a lot of the time I've come on this podcast and said, I think a lot of what he did in kind of stirring up a lot of controversy was really targeted and aimed in trying to pin a lot of the blame and negative tension on himself rather than his players. In a season where he kind of probably realized, okay, I don't think a three-peat is a true possibility here just with this roster makeup. Let's not have the media focus on how bad this team, or not I don't think bad's the right word, but how this team maybe isn't meeting the expectations of the previous two, but rather how much of, for say, maybe the media thinks I'm a crybaby. Maybe they'll talk about that instead of this team struggling on the court. And I do think that he's come out and said that he likes how he's kind of able to get back to a normal offseason going into this next year as opposed to what it was the previous 2 years where he's throwing out first pitches. He's got to go to the White House. He's doing all that. He can just get back to being strictly a basketball coach, which I think is what he wants. And I think is what this program needs to get back on track to being a national championship contender going into this next season. And again, I definitely would argue that game plan he had against Florida might have been his best coaching job at UConn, even more so than what he did in any of the games in that 2-year run that UConn.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. 10 is probably the best thing yet. It's Dan Hurley, one of the best.
I also think important note to add is just the retention of your assistant coaches. Luke Murray and Kamani Young field head coaching offers every single offseason, and UConn has to come up and match. They're probably both making around mid-high major head coaching money by staying at UConn. And I really don't know how much longer this program is going to be able to keep both those guys around. It's inevitable that those guys are going to go off and get a head coaching job at some point. But I think to be able to keep those guys around, just what both of them do, Luke Murray, X's and O's wise, Kamani Young, that, and on top of what he does in the recruiting tail, I think it's just so important keeping those guys around. And what I think is best coaching staff head to toe in the country still.
That's some very in-depth points. Now, how do we feel about the Big East as a whole? If you watched our previous episode on St. John's, you can definitely check out. He gave the Big East a 9. I think it's probably worth keeping that. The Big East is very, very tough this year compared to last year. UConn is right on the tail of St. John's. I think this is going to be a dogfight to win the Big East. I think both teams could win it. I do feel like UConn is not the favorite at the moment. I'll give it to St. John's, but there's a great spot. And beyond that, you have Creighton, as always. You have another reloaded Marquette team. You have dark horses in Providence, in Georgetown, and even in Xavier. I feel like this is a conference that is going to turn a lot of heads again, and it's going to make it look like the old Big East of the early 2020s. That was very strong, very deep, and looked like the best conference in all college basketball.
Yeah, I'm definitely in the same boat as you. Considering we gave St. John's a 9 when rating the conference, I think as UConn probably being a top 2 team going to the Big East play this upcoming year, I would also put them at a 9. I do have them also behind St. John's opening up the season going to Big East play, but they definitely have full capabilities of being able to win the Big East regular season and tournament. And again, the Big East is a lot better than what it was last year. UConn is going to be the benefit of being able to play in a lot more quad 1 games. Resume building wins. potentially in the Big East as opposed to what they had the last year. Hopefully avoid some of the really bad losses like at Seton Hall. Not a good loss there. Hopefully we don't have any more of those this upcoming season, but I think there's a lot more higher marquee matchups that we're going to see in the Big East this year. Really excited for the Big East. I think head to toe, it's a lot deeper than what it was this past season where it was really top heavy. But yeah, I mean, St. John's, UConn, I think Creighton's going to be really good once again. Make your pick of Marquette, Xavier, Georgetown, Providence, whoever's next in that fold, and you can rank them head to toe down from there. But I think this conference is going to be a lot better than what we've seen out of them this past season.
Certainly. I think that's, again, great Big East, and we're going to need it. And I think that leads us last with vibes. Personally, I know your thing is a little different, but from an outside standpoint, I think vibes are very solid. You're keeping a lot of your players. You're adding some new ones in, but there are a lot of questions. Can this team really do what the past or those previous teams have? Which I think levies the question for you. Do you think UConn can win it all this year?
I do think UConn can win it all, but a lot of that is depending on guys making leaps. Solo Ball made a leap this past season, but needs to continue to do more. He needs to do more off the dribble. He needs to do more playmaking. He needs to become a much better defender, which I have seen some UConn practice clips on their Instagram. Solo Ball does look like he's become a much better defender. I think Jalen Stewart, who like we talked about, think is going to be in a starting role. I think he needs to make a big leap, try to get towards that double-digit mark in his scoring average. Alex Caravan can go back to being that third or fourth option like he was his first 2 years at UConn and not have so much on his plate the way he did this past season. I think Terrace Reed has a chance to make a huge, huge jump, potentially be first-team Big East guy, Big East Player of the Year, maybe All-American. Same thing goes for Solo Ball, by the way. I definitely think he has a chance to be that. Ellis Demery, I think I'm really, really high on. Of course, it does concern me a little bit, the adjustment period he's probably going to experience in the early stretches of next season. But I think, again, he's a Dan Hurley guard. He plays defense. He can do a lot off the dribble. Someone who I'm comfortable handling the ball in tight spots. And I think the depth is really, really good. A lot better than what we had this past season. Malachi Smith, I think, is going to be great. Braylon Mullins, same thing. Eric Ribe, I think, will provide a good spark off the bench, backing up Terrace Reed. And, yeah, I mean, Dwayne Karoma, Alec Malender, when those guys committed UConn, and when I made those videos breaking those commitments down, I definitely think if they're ever in a position where they need to be on the floor, I'm not worried about them struggling all too much. I think they'll be able to fit into UConn's system. They provide unique skill sets, each of those two guys. And Furphy, Ross, I'm not sure how much those guys are going to play, but if they get on the floor, I'm sure, they'll be fine. It won't be anything too detrimental. I think the number one thing is just staying healthy. But I'm definitely really high on this team. I very much feel that it's really giving me the vibes, kind of how they were going into 2023. I would probably put vibes at a 9, honestly.
Really? I was thinking more of an 8. I'll be honest, I'm a little more skeptical at the moment. I think that personally, there can be a little bit of a drop. I don't fully have them as a national championship team. I think that there is great opportunity in that. I do see the 2023 comp very strongly. I think this team could hit the ground running, but I think the questions are just a little bit too high in my point. And given that last year they were ranked very high to start the year and then very quickly fell off and could not maintain any opportunities there, I don't think it's last year's team, but I think that the exercise of caution should be kept.
To counteract your point there, I think last year a lot of what it was them really just getting the benefit of the doubt, being the defending back-to-back national champs. If you take Dan Hurley off that coaching staff, that roster last year was probably a borderline top 25, top 20 roster. And I think Dan Hurley really elevated them to being that preseason number 3 team. This year, it's a lot different. The way this roster is constructed just makes so much more sense to me. And you back that up with the coaching staff that's there. I think this team is more well-rounded and more suited to go and built. They're just more suited and built to go compete to get to a Final Four. And honestly, I probably would have had them at an 8-2 before their out-of-conference schedule was announced. They have an absolute gauntlet of a schedule in their out-of-conference play. They're playing the likes of BYU, Arizona, Florida, forgetting who else, Kansas. They're going to go into Allen Fieldhouse. They're going to play Illinois at the Garden. Really, really excited. And if they're able to come out that stretch, say undefeated, that might be enough to catapult them to being the number one team in the country. Not saying they're going to go undefeated. We got to see how teams play, and then maybe I'll draw my predictions once we get into the season. But I'm really excited. I think Dan Hurley and the athletic director coming together, put that schedule together, is really telling of how much Hurley believes in this team as opposed to last year's team. Where last year's out of conference schedule, obviously Maui was a disaster, and that didn't end up working out the way they wanted it to. They couldn't get further and play some of the better teams. But if we're being honest, the out of conference schedule really wasn't all too good. This year, it's a lot different. You're playing a lot of the teams that can compete to get into a Final Four and win a national championship. And I think that just tells a lot about how much belief and trust Dan Hurley has in this year's team as opposed to last.
No, I definitely see that. I will say, and just because I do want to mention that conference schedule, that's a very good one for the non-conference. But once again, we don't know how that's going to work. It wasn't that good last year. They haven't always had the best non-conference performances. That said, there is a lot of trust here. I think, once again, just the caution of the scenario warrants that 8. I think it's probably a safe thing to keep it there. But this is a team that should not be overlooked in any sense. This gives me, I think, the 2023 vibes are just keeping on my head with this one. I really do like where this UConn team goes. You got to give to Hurley for rebuilding. This has been one of the better cycles for him, and I think he can possibly put away the disaster that was last year in the backview mirror and move on to what he's more used to doing, winning championships.
Yeah, a Husky fan can only hope. I'm super pumped about this upcoming year. Really cannot wait for the first game at Gamble Pavilion this upcoming season. Of course, we still got to wait quite a while for that, but hopefully it'll come sooner than later. But I think that's going to take care of everything we have for this episode of the State of the Program series / Saturdays and Storrs podcast. As always, if you like this podcast or anything else, engage with our videos in any way you can. And until next episode, we'll see you all next time.